Hi, welcome to session one of the fourth topic of the semester, titled The Slave Trade and the Coming of Slavery in Virginia Colony. We're going to be looking at this topic, which is going to span in the periods between 1444 all the way to 1740. So this is session one of this fourth topic that we're initiating here, which actually also opens up the second portion, the second segment of the semester, the second historical period, in which we're going to be now looking at the development of colonial America, so the colonial period. So in the first period, in the first historical period, we analyzed the ancient world all the way to the age of discovery and early colonization, and we looked at three topics. We did not really go into the process of looking at the development of the colony, just the settlements, if you will, the early establishment, the early founding of the colonies, looking at both economic and religious factors. But now, in this second historical period that we're initiating, we're actually going to look at the colonial period itself. So we're going to look at the formation of colonial society, American colonial society, look at different groups, again, that were, of course, forming colonial society, particularly, again, the English settlers that are coming primarily from England. But as we'll see, again, in this second historical period, there will be, of course, immigrant groups coming from different parts of Europe, not just from Great Britain. There will be, of course, Irish, Scottish, German immigrants also pouring into the colonies, and of course, there will be also peoples from Africa that will be brought to, particularly, but not exclusively, but particularly to the southern colonies, like Virginia, for example, the Carolinas and Georgia, the vast majority, that is to say. And of course, there's also the interaction between the European immigrants and the African slaves, and of course the Native American groups. And of course, we're going to analyze, of course, those relationships in this second historical period. We're going to look at, change as well in another topic, the process of change, how the colonies were changing, for the reasons why they were changing, things like the search for land, immigration, for example, the rise of a more material culture that changed the religious communities that we discussed in the past. So we're going to look at that, of course. And of course, at the end of the second historical period, we're going to look at the process of independence, which closes the colonial period. Again, the process of the American Revolution, the independence movement, that is to say. So there will be three topics, again, looking at the colonial period. We're going to start with, again, understanding. In this case, we're going to open up the colonial period by understanding the influx, again, of the peoples of Africa, the African slaves, so-called, again, that were introduced in the 1600s and the 1700s to the American British colonies. And again, we're going to pay attention to the slave trade particularly, and we're also going to be paying attention as a case study to just one of the British colonies, again, in North America, Virginia, and the reasons why, again, Virginia colony introduced this system of labor, again, called slave labor, again. So by the late 1600s, early 1700s, is going to be a shift, a transition into this new labor system. And we're going to actually analyze the reasons, again, why that occurred. Okay, so this is just, again, the general introduction to this topic. And now let's proceed then to present the slide. So you'll see the topic here Again, the slave trade and the coming of slavery to Virginia colony from 1444 to 1740. So this is the title. We're going to spend about 3 meetings, again, 3 sessions, full sessions, talking about, elaborating on this topic quite fully. And again, it's important to understand the table of contents, the main segments that we're going to be covering for this topic. We're going to actually just open up today with understanding slavery in the ancient world. It is very important to understand how ancient societies carried out, what it was called back then slavery, by the way, which we're going to actually pay attention as to how they actually called this practice, etc., and how and why human societies actually instituted again this type of practice. Okay, so it is important just to kind of have a very general knowledge of how slavery was carried out, how it existed in the ancient world. And then we're going to look into the second part, the slave trade itself, the rise of, again, this commercial process, this commercial exchange in which we're going to see the peoples within Africa itself, of course, developing slave markets, if you will, trading slaves for products, etc. But also there will be an understanding of how people out of Africa from other places outside of Africa will be drawn into the continent of Africa precisely to tap into this existing market, the slave market, in order to export slaves. So we're going to look at what were the reasons, that people from places like the Middle East, for example, or Europe, etc., went into Africa in order to trade, again, with the African kingdoms, with the African merchants for slaves. We're going to actually look at that, of course, which takes us to the actual story of the transatlantic slave trade, in which the Portuguese are trading with the kingdoms of West Africa by 1444, and connecting, of course, the slave trade with the Europeans, therefore more closely, and with the navigation systems that were already being developed during the 1400s and 1500s. We're going to see that with the discovery of America by Columbus, the American continent will be also connected. It will be the recipient, if you will, of peoples from Africa, as the Portuguese and the Spaniards are bringing, of course, African slaves to the Americas. So again, that will be assessed very fully, the slave trade itself. And at the very end, in the third segment of this topic, we're going to actually cover how and why African slavery, this system of labor, was introduced into the British colony of Virginia, even though it was also introduced in the other colonies like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, the southern colonies, and it was also introduced in some of the northern colonies as well. But it was predominantly, again, the most important system of labor for the southern colonies. So we're going to just look at Virginia just because it serves as a very good case study, okay, for how and why, again, the British colonists, in this case the Virginians, decided again to import slaves again and adopt this institution, this system of labor, that is to say. So this is the table of contents, okay? So it just kind of guides you as to what are the main parts of this topic, and that way your notes are going to be very well organized, because again, there are specific segments that are being elaborated, of course, about this topic. All right, so let's start with part one. And so we start with understanding first and foremost, before we go into the slave trade, etc., so it's extremely important to first understand slavery in the ancient world. This is a very good way of introducing to the study of slavery, in other words, which it's essential for understanding world history, not just a particular regional history or the history of a specific group of people, etc., but rather the history of humanity. So it is very important because when you study world history, human history, we realize that the practice of slavery, by the way, is one of the most ancient and universal institutions that was formulated by early societies, by early sedentary, stationary societies, with the rise of villages, with the rise of the first communities. We discussed that quite thoroughly in the first topic. By the way, the transition towards a sedentary society, again, thousands of years ago, the transition between from nomadic, groups, bands, hunters and gatherers, into early farming. Now, we covered that in the first topic, by the way. That occurred in different areas of the world. So, ever since the rise of those sedentary societies, the people that made the transition into the village setting and building communities, ever since, what we're going to see is that certain individuals within those communities were actually serving the leading members of the community, if you will, as servants. So when we talk about slavery in the ancient world, we're actually talking about servitude. Okay, servitude. It's not the term was not coined when we say the word slavery. It was not coined until the 14 and 1500s, by the way, of the contemporary era. In other words, about 5-6 centuries ago, the word slavery, or slave was coined, and it was used to denote individuals who were actually servants, that is to say serfs, that is to say a serf or a servant. So again, it's just different terminologies, again, pretty much describe a condition that people find themselves in. And again, the condition that we're actually talking about here is one of servitude, that is to say. So that's very important, again, that we're talking about servitude or serfdom, serfs, that is to say. And again, they have existed for quite a while, ever since the rise of sedentary societies, by the way, in different areas of the globe. That's why I say it's universal. When I mean universal, is that virtually every group in every civilization, every culture from around the world has practiced it in one way or another, or in one degree or another. Again, so there's very degrees in which it was practiced by different people, different kinds of servitude or serfdom that existed. So we're not really talking about a uniform kind of practice that everybody was using, simultaneously, identical. I mean, there's different types of servitude that existed. And so you have to understand that when we talk about servitude in the ancient world, it's just so diverse. Okay, there's many varieties, many expressions of that. Okay, so they have to be assessed regionally, specifically to the group of people that would want to study. And again, we have to understand the differences, by the way. So again, this is extremely important because then we understand that, okay, so this goes back again to really the beginning of early societies. It's very ancient, it's thousands of years old, and it was practiced virtually, everywhere in different places. It was practiced in Africa, as well as in Europe, as well as in the Middle East, Asia, and even, Native Americans, by the way. Likewise, there were Native American societies that also practiced servitude, by the way. So it's, again, very, very, very ancient and very universal, that is to say. Now, in the ancient world, it is also very, very important to note that there was a certain rationale, a certain logic, that people use to justify the practice of servitude. Okay, so for the most part, if not, again, this is pretty much common all across human cultures, human societies around the world, in the ancient world. What we find is that the people that were enserved, or that were servants, that is to say, were believed that particular condition of servitude was their life purpose, it was their life mission, that is to say. So in the ancient world, people use religious ideas to justify the existence of servitude. Okay, and even the serfs, in many cases, the servants in the ancient world accepted that condition because of the kind of religious ideas that prevailed during those times. So what I'm actually trying to say here is that in the ancient world, people were guided by religion. Okay? Religion was the basis, it was the foundation of human societies. It serves to justify for example, the social institutions that were created by those groups, the rulers, for example, the priests, the religious leaders. They all use religion to justify their leadership. In other words, look, we were chosen by the gods. We were created by the gods. We descend from a lineage of chiefs, a lineage of rulers, a lineage of healers, etc., that go back to the beginning of the world. And when the world was created, the gods created this particular lineage to rule over society. So religion served as the basis to justify even the existence of the religious institutions, the priesthood, the temples, the rituals, and even the rulers themselves were legitimized by religion. So that was, again, the basis of society. Okay, and even how people understood the world around them, how they explained how things worked, etc. They also used religion for that. Again, what we call science today, in the ancient world, it was just religion. So therefore, the division of society into different groups was also justified by religion. Society was divided into different groups. So there were peasants, for example, the people actually working the land, growing crops. But there were also in those societies people that were artisans. So this is a separate group. They do artwork. There's another group that might be involved in commercial activities, the merchants. For instance, the merchants. And that's a different grouping. That's a different group that is engaged in a different activity. There is, of course, the priests, as I mentioned, and the rulers, the different groups as well. They have different functions, different responsibilities, a different status as well. There's the administrators, the public administrators. Also, that's what they do. They administer the state, or they collect tribute, again, what we call taxes today, etc. They organize the society. They do planning, etc. And of course, there's warriors. There's people that actually defend the community. They do that. I mean, they have they have a natural ability, they have skills to conduct warfare. So that's a separate group. So it was believed in the ancient world that the division of society into all of those groups was the way that the gods had created humanity. That humans were created very uniquely to perform different functions. And again, this is how people believe that it was the natural state for some individuals to be warriors. There was the natural state for some to be priests, to be chiefs, to be peasants, to be merchants, to be artisans. It was their natural state. That's how they were actually crafted or created by the gods. They have a specific fate, a specific destiny to fulfill, a specific life purpose, life mission, if you will, each one to carry out. And it was important that they carried out those missions because that's how they connected with the gods, and they will find in the afterlife, a place to rest or a place where they can actually come back and continue serving, the world through their particular actions as warriors or priests, etc. So again, there's so many different, belief systems around the world. I'm not saying that they all had the same religion or anything. It's just that there's so many different religious belief systems. But those religious belief systems were used to justify the division of society into different groupings, and that each group had a certain destiny, a certain fate to fulfill. And that, of course, served to create social stability. Okay, so societies were stable because people pretty much accepted their fate. Like, well, I was born into a family of peasants, and this is my mission, to be a peasant. Okay, if you were born into the family of merchants, more than likely that's what you will do, etc. So people pretty much accepted that because you were born in a specific family, specific, that belong to a specific group. People pretty much accepted that that's where was their fate. So therefore, the servants, what we today simply call slaves, by the way, but in the ancient world were servants, or serfs, were people that also were considered to be individuals who were fulfilling a specific mission, a mission that was given to them by the gods. And that mission was to serve others through their labor. That is to say, they can be serving a family in the household, or they will be serving a ruler, personally, the personal servant, again, of a chief, etc., or the personal servant of a landlord, for example. In Europe was common. The serfs, again, the European serfs, that is to say. So again, when you look around the world, the servants believed that was their destiny. It was their natural state. This is my mission, in other words. Not that they were totally accepting of that particular situation. Okay, so this is not to say that they were simply happy, etc., with their condition, because sometimes they will be serving, a very, an individual who, was not very, compassionate towards them, etc. And so you do have those situations, again, in which some servants just found themselves in a situation in which it was, extremely, uncomfortable and painful. As well. So yes, so there were, of course, many situations of that. And then, of course, many of them actually run away or try to escape, etc. Of course, we do have that, of course. Slave revolts, for example, were common in in ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, of course. And it just when the situation for serfs became so uncomfortable, so extreme, the treatment is when, of course, humans, of course, try to get away from that situation or take action, of course. But when you look all over the world, religion was used as a way to justify, to validate, again, the practice of servitude. In other words, that this is what the gods, want. This is the way the gods created the world. Okay, there's a different god for every group. Okay, and people pray to those gods: the god of merchants, the god of priests, the god of etc. And so religion was used to create, of course, a certain sense of conformity, if you will, in the system. So to create certain stability in the system for people to accept their role, that is to say. So this is very common all over the world, despite the fact that there's, of course, moments of resistance and rebellions, of course. But for the most part, when you look at the ancient world, again, this is again how societies were kept stable. By the way, by using religion and justifying the practice of servitude, that is to say, okay. Now, another, of course, very important piece of information here is, so how were the first servants created? Okay, so when you see servants in a specific community or in an empire, that are like Rome and so on, or Native Americans, like the Aztecs, for example, of central Mexico, well, there were indigenous, of course, groups in North America that also carried out the practice, by the way. So, so the question is, how were the first servants actually created? Were there just volunteers, people that just gave themselves up again to a certain community so they can actually be, and served? And the answer is sometimes that happened. Sometimes there were, volunteers, people that volunteered to become servants whenever their communities experience hardship. If you belong to a certain community that is disintegrating because of droughts, lack of resources, lack of food, or plagues, etc., the members of that community will simply disintegrate and move into different directions, and they will just simply try to move into another community. But it was very difficult to simply go and be accepted into another community unless you traded something in return, and sometimes you traded your own labor, that is to say. So they gave themselves up again in terms of, well, if you adopt me, okay, in your community, I will serve you, okay, I will do work for you, etc. But I need some form of shelter, I need some protection, I need food, and I'm willing to work for it, and so on and so forth. So yes, there's that. Again, that took place in the ancient world. But what's also very, very common in the ancient world is that in many cases the servants came from actually people that were captured during conflicts between communities, between tribes, between different kingdoms, or even between different empires that wage war on one another. So in many cases, what happens is that the party that was defeated during those conflicts, in many cases, the populations of those parties, whether it was a city or a tribe or a village, didn't matter. But if it was defeated, then the members will be given the opportunity to live, to continue living, only if they accepted the condition of servitude, that is to say. So that happened quite a bit, again, in the ancient world, whether we're talking about Africa or we're talking about the Native Americans and so on. This was a common practice. Again, we call prisoners of war, again, POWs. They will be regarded as natural slaves, that is to say. So the question is, how were the first servants created? Some of them were volunteers, okay, but there's also, again, this constant tradition, practice, in which if you needed servants, sometimes warfare was the way to acquire, again, those servants. So, again, during those conflicts, what happened is that, again, you capture people and you spare their lives in order to bring them to your own community or kingdom or city, and they will be servants, by the way, okay? So now that we understand, again, slavery in the ancient world, now let's proceed to look then at slavery in ancient Africa, okay? Because not that looking at slavery in other regions is not important, it's crucial, of course, but we have to understand slavery in Africa in the ancient world, because it is precisely from Africa that the slaves that will be brought to the Americas through the slave trade are coming from. Okay, and they're going to be coming particularly from the west coast of Africa, although there will be certain other regions, of course, as well, that will also is provide, of course, slaves to the merchants that were bringing the slaves to America. But the vast majority are really coming from the west central coast of the continent of Africa. So again, this is just a very, very quick survey that will look at slavery in Africa. And what we learned is that slavery in Africa is one of the most ancient institutions, by the way. Okay, it's thousands of years old. Some archaeologists have found early traces of slavery as far back as 6,000 BC. Okay, so we're talking about 8,000 years ago. Early traces of servitude. That is to say, that's what we're actually talking about. Servitude, by the way. So thousands of years old. And as a matter of fact, according to some archaeologists, although there's of course dispute, there's debate, some of the greatest civilizations of the continent of Africa were actually built by the use of slave labor. Okay, for example, Egypt. Okay, the civilization known as Egypt, located in Africa. Egypt is actually located in the northeastern section of Africa. It emerged thousands of years ago. Perhaps it's a very, very ancient civilization. By the way, again, there's a lot of disputes as to what is the specific date from where we see the rise of ancient Egypt, but we're looking at anywhere between 8,000 BC to 10,000 BC, or even more. So this is a very ancient civilization. Okay, so what we know is that Egypt itself was built by what we mean about Egypt is the canals, the roads, the temples, etc. Some even suggest that even the pyramids, although there's a lot of debate whether the pyramids were actually built by slaves or not. But again, it is assumed that they were, by the way. But again, Egypt, for example, was built by slaves, so much so that the name Egypt itself was not the original actually name of this civilization. Egypt was a term or a word that was later used, much, much later, that actually means the land of the slaves. The word Egypt, again, is something that other peoples outside of Egypt will refer the Egyptians as. They're not really called Egypts or Egyptians, by the way. So they said, oh, this is the land of the slaves, because we understand that this is a civilization that is sustained by slave labor, or what we call servitude, of course, servants. So again, the construction work, the public works, and so on, again, that created the civilization, or whether we're talking about the agricultural projects, and so on. Again, they were all, of course, built through slave labor. And of course, much later, there will be another civilization known as Mali, the Kingdom of Mali, or Mali, in the northern regions of Africa. That was one of the wealthiest, by the way, the most prosperous kingdoms of Africa, of the entire continent, much, much later. I mean, Egypt is really ancient history, by the way, but Mali is more recent, by the way, was also built by the use of slaves as well. So we know that this institution existed in the continent of Africa, so much so, once again, that the greatest civilization of the continent, Egypt, and one of the most prosperous, wealthiest kingdoms, Mali, were actually built, again, by that institution, through the system, the servitude. And so it had existed for thousands of years. And as a matter of fact, when you study African cultures, you see that, of course, there's a multiplicity of different linguistic groups, ethnic groups living in the continent of Africa. Of course, hundreds of different ethnic groups, each with their own language, so on and so forth. So it's a very diverse continent with diverse ethnic and cultural groups. But what we find is that in the continent of Africa, slavery had existed virtually almost in the entire continent, because the peoples of Africa shared certain values in common, okay, when it came to wealth. That serves to explain why servitude was so important, so dominant, if you will, in the economic activities, as well as in the building of the societies, the building of civilizations, the building of kingdoms, by the way. And that shared value, of course, is the value of wealth. What the African peoples consider valuable, what actually makes an individual, for example, wealthy, what makes anybody wealthy, for that matter, is really in Africa, across the continent. The shared value is that wealth is really based on two particular type of resources, if you will. One is people, what you call human, of course. With people itself are considered wealth, one of the sources of wealth, in cattle. Okay, people and cattle. So what we mean about this is that when we mean people, what we mean is that in reality what we're talking about here is labor. Okay, when we referred, to the concept of wealth as people, or people as the concept of wealth, better stated, what in Africa they're actually indicating is labor. Okay, the labor that people provide, that is very, very valuable, that is to say. And so how many people follow a certain individual? Okay, how many people actually follow a certain individual will determine the wealth of that individual. So if an individual has 10 followers, yeah, that's okay. It's just, it's considered to be wealth. That individual is wealthy, but it's not super wealthy. Okay, it just, there's 10 people that that individual commands, for work, etc. But if somebody commands 50 people, then of course he's already a chief of a certain village, for example. He's the chief. He has 50 people that he's actually commanding, if you will. People follow that individual. They're faithful, loyal, and that individual is wealthy. But if somebody has 100 or 1,000, of course, individuals following that individual, that person can already, become a king or a queen, for that matter. Okay, so you can build a kingdom, super wealthy, that is to say. And of course, if you own cattle, if you are driving cattle, if you're handling cattle, if you have, let's say, 10 cows or 50 cows, the number of cows that are under your command or control will determine, of course, how much wealth you have. So again, this is very important because if you contrast, for example, the concept of wealth or property, let's say, in Africa and then in Europe, you'll see that in Europe is quite different, in that in Europe, the wealth is based on land and gold. If you own land, okay, if you're a landowner, that is to say, depending how much land you got, and also if you have gold, that will determine your status, your prestige, your wealth, that is to say, if you're wealthy or not. So this is very, very important to note, because in Africa we're not going to see, of course, those distinctions in that people can actually own land or gold and say that they're wealthy. Okay, it's not going to happen. Of course, not until much recent times. But in the ancient world, land couldn't be owned by an individual in Africa because of the religion in Africa. Many of the religions of Africa, like Native Americans, come from the understanding that the land can never be owned by humans because the land are part of Mother Nature, okay, the goddess, if you will, the Earth Mother, that is to say. So we're just the children of the earth. So how can the children own the mother? Okay, so this is a concept that is virtually non-existent in that continent because of religion and gold. Even though they do have a lot of gold in Africa, they don't use it as currency as well. Okay, they use it for religious purposes. So in Africa, therefore, people are considered a source of wealth precisely because, as I mentioned, because of labor. Okay, so human labor equals wealth. Okay, the labor of humans. That is to say, in Africa, this is what makes an individual wealthy. So if you have followers, 50, 100, 1,000, tens of thousands, that see you as the leader, as the chief, as the person that the gods created, again, to lead society, because you descend from a specific lineage, of a family lineage that goes back to the gods, then you are wealthy. And again, this is extremely prevalent in Africa. It exists throughout the continent. This idea, by the way. So human labor, again, is considered the source of wealth in Africa because through that labor you can generate food. Okay, food production. That's why it's valuable, because if you're the leader of those people that follow you, then you can command people to produce food. How? Well, farming. You can actually command a group of people to go out into the woods for hunting, wild game, fishing, and so on, so you can generate food. And food is of utmost importance in Africa. Without food, you cannot sustain a community. So you need labor to generate that food. If you're commanding that labor, and people simply, see you as the legitimate ruler or leader and obey, of course, your command, that is, very important. You're actually doing something to sustain a community. You're building wealth, and wealth is measured by, of course, the ability to produce food production. Also, public works. Labor is important in Africa because that serves, again, to build public works like the kingdoms I mentioned, Mali, for example. There's a multiplicity, by the way, of different kingdoms in Africa. I just named one of the most prosperous, the wealthiest, if you will, kingdom, Mali, but also Egypt, of course, the civilization of Egypt. But there's a multiplicity of different kingdoms, by the way. And those kings or queens, again, were able to command people to build things like roads, temples, official buildings, waterworks, clearing land, so on and so forth, for agriculture and the like. Public works. So labor is necessary if you're going to build also a kingdom, or you're going to build a city. Okay, roads were built for trade, for example. You build a road that connects your kingdom with another kingdom or a series of cities, and you're engaging in trade. That's important. So again, this is, how Africa, of course, is carrying out the institution of servitude and how and why it's important. Of course, artworks, in Africa, what we see is that labor was also used to generate artwork, artisans that were weaving textiles, for example, again, clothing, items and so on by hand and so on, or artisans that were crafting figurines or different types of artwork, religious art and so on, that was often used for trade. So you generate artwork that can be exchanged for other products that your community needs. So you have people that are very, very artistic and they can actually craft artwork for you. You can just, command them to do so. So their artwork can be traded, again, maybe for food and so on and so forth. There was a specific kingdom in Africa when the Portuguese arrived in the 1440s, the Kingdom of Congo, in which there were about 1,000 artisans or more that were actually weaving textiles, which the king was using for trade. Okay, so it was commercializing within Africa vast quantities of products that the artisans, in this case, were producing for the monarch. So again, the prosperity of the kingdom depended on that, of course, on that type of trade. Also, we're going to see that in many cases also the servants in Africa were used for household activities. So there were even families, let's say families of certain communities or certain kingdoms, etc., within Africa that actually had servants. So we're not just talking about necessarily a very prominent individual that is extremely important in the community, like the leader and the chief, that was the only one that could own servants, but rather that there were also families, households, if you will, that also had servants of their own. Even though they were humble, in terms of that they were not necessarily living in palaces or in large residences, etc., they nonetheless had, of course, servants of their own, serving the household in terms of taking care of the children, doing cooking, and perhaps doing some gardening and so on and so forth, household activities as well. So in Africa, it was very common. The rule was that the acquisition of people for servitude occurred through warfare, through war, that is to say. It was very common. And that happened because in many instances, a specific chief was losing a lot of its followers, a lot of population. Of course, you have a population in decline. If you're running a kingdom or you're the chief of several villages, but it just so happened that there is an outbreak of some disease taking place, of course, that is bringing down the population. So you used to command, let's say, 2,000 people, but you're now down to 1,000 because of that particular outbreak. Or there's famine, so on and so forth. So what actually happened there is that chiefs or rulers or kings that were actually losing populations will try to compensate for the loss of population, which was really the loss of wealth, by actually raiding neighboring communities or tribal groups that were living inside of the forest and so on. And what you will do is not wage war as a means to, again, decimate those populations, but rather to actually carry out what is called a forced adoption. Okay, so warfare was not used to decimate populations, but rather to capture people, again, prisoners of war, so they can become natural servants. that is to say. That was the idea. So you will adopt them. In other words, you force adopting them because you're actually bringing them to live with you, so the chief can compensate with, again, the loss of the population that the chief experienced. And so he's actually bringing more people over the community, and they're going to be servants. And the idea is that they're only going to be servants for that particular lifetime, So the idea is you're going to serve the community for your entire lifetime, but you're going to be protected here in the community. You're going to be, given maybe some land so you can actually grow your own food, etc. And you can actually marry inside of this community and have your own offspring, but your offspring is not going to inherit your status of servant. That is to say, it's only you that is going to be, of course, serving the community for your entire lifetime. But again, you can actually just integrate, by having land to work on your own, etc. You have to serve the ruler. You might be assigned to serve a priest, or, in the construction of temples, etc. But eventually, you're going to be adopted over time because you're going to marry inside of that community and have an offspring of your own that over time, they're simply going to become part of the group. In other words, over time, that is to say. So again, this is very important, just to kind of understand, this process of slavery again in ancient Africa and how it was actually carried out. And again, as I mentioned, that had a lot to do with the fact that human labor is very valuable, again, for all the four different aspects I just explained. But also, in Africa, there's yet another resource that is considered to be extremely, extremely valuable, that any individual that owns this resource is considered to be wealthy, and that is cattle. Okay? And the reason for that is because if you own cattle in Africa, even though you have no followers of your own, but if you do own cattle, 5 cows or 10 or 20, etc., depending on the amount, will determine your wealth. But what that meant is that you're wealthy, you're considered to be very important in the community because you're providing, of course, food to the community in terms of the meat, that can sometimes feed an entire community. There will be a religious celebration coming up. You say, and there's this particular full moon that we celebrate this particular god or goddess, and we have to have a feast. And so in order to actually have the feast, we need to, slaughter a cow and, actually provide meal for everybody, and of course do the offerings to the goddess or the god, etc. And so, this is where the individual comes in and say, I do have the cow. Okay, I can provide it, I can feed all the people. So you were regarded as wealthy because you're actually doing something for the gods. You're going to render your cow to the community, feed people, and people are going to consider you to be a very, very honorable person with prestige, with status. You're extremely wealthy. Again, you're providing protein, of course, but also because the cattle was used as a fertilizing machine as well. Cattle is valuable in Africa, not only because you're feeding people, but because they serve to replenish the soil with the lost nutrients. Of course, that takes place with intensive farming, that is to say. So if you're herding cattle, let's say 20 cows, etc., the place where you're actually keeping the cattle is going to become very, very fertile in the future, that farmers are going to value very much because you're aiding in the production of food, not only by providing meat to the community during those religious celebrations, but also for the fertilizing, again, that takes place. From the cattle itself, you're grazing cattle in certain areas, that is to say. So those are the two sources of cattle, again, for for the African peoples. And when we're talking about people and cattle, this is what is valuable in Africa. And most of the individuals that are revered, followed, and people that are considered to be the wealthiest individuals are precisely the individuals that have the most amount of followers under their command, that already earned the status of leaders or chiefs or kings, etc., or people that actually own a lot of cattle. And of course, there's a market, of course, for servants in Africa that is extremely extensive across the African continent. It was called slave markets, by the way. Were very, very visible, very, very prominent in Africa, in which one of the things that the African groups, the African societies traded the most was actually servants. This is something that was, very easy to see in the marketplace. Whenever there's a kingdom in Africa, for example, that has several cities, every city has a market, and it was very, very common that inside of those markets, one of the products that you can actually purchase or traded was actually servants. That is to say, and they were traded, across the continent. There were trails, merchant trails that carry peoples again all over the continent back and forth, because it was a very valuable resource, by the way. So again, this is a very, very ancient institution, an ancient practice that really goes back thousands of years again into the past in the ancient world. So therefore, now that we understand that, again, that's part one. Now let's move into part two of this topic, in order to look at now the slave trade. Okay, because as I mentioned in the beginning, it is precisely from Africa that we're going to see the export of servants, by the way, okay, into different areas of the world. And so this process of this export slave trade out of Africa is now known by world historians simply as the slave trade. Of course, there's numerous books that have been written about, again, this process, this historical process in which Africa, at some point, particularly as we move into the 8th century, 9th century of the contemporary era and onwards, where we're going to see that the continent of Africa will be the largest exporter, of course, of servants to the world at large. That is to say, even though, again, servitude is taking place all over the planet, in different societies and different cultures, of course, this is, again, a process that continues to exist all over the world. But what I'm actually trying to say is that there will be now an export trade taking place from Africa to the rest of the world, in which now Africa will be the major exporter, if you will, again, of servants to different areas of the globe. And again, this is now known as the slave trade itself. This is what we're going to actually look at, of course, in part two. So let us look then at the origins of the African export slave trade. Okay, so why is it? So historically, again, this has to be a factor that led to the rise of this export slave trade from Africa, out of Africa. What was the reason then, in other words, that peoples outside of the continent of Africa were attracted to the continent of Africa precisely in pursuit of labor, of human labor? What was actually, again, taking place in the world that led thousands of different peoples from different regions of the globe to come to Africa in pursuit of labor? And historians, with almost very little disagreement, identify that the number one factor, again, that initiated the African slave trade, the export slave trade, is sugar. Okay, was actually the rise of sugar production, the commercialization of sugar is perhaps the number one factor that led to the rise of the export slave trade from out of Africa. Okay, so sugar, of course, is a plant that was commercialized, by the way, starting roughly about the 700s, 800s AD, and is going to be a commodity that is over time going to dominate the commercial exchange of the different peoples of the world. In other words, one of the most consumed food products in the world by the 15 and 1600s. By the 15 and 1600s, it will become the number one mass consumer product worldwide, by the way. This has not always been so, because sugar cane for thousands of years was only known to a specific region of the world, whereas the vast the rest of the human population outside of that region, they didn't even know of the existence of sugar, by the way. Not until the 7th and 800s, of course, AD, of the contemporary era. So sugarcane, what we know, is a plant that was domesticated thousands and thousands of years ago in a region that today is the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, the country of India, and parts of South China as well. Okay, in Southeast Asia, South China. So this is the native region of sugarcane. Okay, it was a wild plant that was domesticated thousands of years ago, and it was domesticated precisely because of its very sweet taste, and it was domesticated to be grown in specific, plots of land where people would actually use the plant in order to actually sweeten foodstuffs, drinks, and so on and so forth, extracting, of course, the sugar out of the cane through various processes, and again adding sugar to foodstuffs and sweets and pastries, for example, desserts, all of that. Again, those were very, very common, of course, food items, foodstuffs of the peoples of India for thousands of years. They have actually sweetened their foods. They have created sweets, pastries, and so on, desserts of various kinds, and sweet drinks like tea. They drink their tea with sugar, etc., and milk, again, that they're very known for. So again, this is the only region that knew about sugar and consumed sugar almost on a daily basis, again, because this is the native region, if you will. So the rest of the world was not really consuming sugar. If you wanted to consume anything sweet, you had to have access to maybe some fruits, sweet fruits of some kind, and also to honey. If you had access to those too, for some reason, then you could actually taste the sweetness, of course, that the sugar will actually offer, that sugar has to offer. But otherwise, the rest of the world was virtually unaware of this. Not until the 700s, what we're going to see is that India is going to be, of course, invaded by different groups coming from the outside. There will be, of course, people moving out of the Middle East, moving into the region of North India, by the way, and actually conquering segments of North India in the 7th and 800s AD. And it is precisely because there's now outside groups moving into India that we're going to see that those groups are going to now export that plant, the sugar cane, into other regions of the world, particularly to the Middle East, and also parts or sections of the Mediterranean Sea. The eastern segments, the eastern regions of the Mediterranean Sea are going to see now the spread of sugar plantations, that is to say, what we're going to see is that when this plant, sugarcane, was exported, people are beginning to find almost an immediate attraction to the sweetness of sugar, that it will create an instant demand, a market again for sugar, an instant again. And again, this is a product that virtually, everybody, regardless of age, for example, from children to adults to people of advanced age, everybody really finds, of course, the sweetness of sugar to be irresistible. So again, it found an immediate demand everywhere this sugar cane, this plant, was actually introduced, and there's going to be a market again for that. So again, we're going to see the commercialization, therefore, of sugar that led to the so-called sugar plantation. Sugar plantations are now spreading across the Middle East, particularly in regions that have a tropical, very hot and humid climate and environment. This is the ideal setting for the production of sugar, by the way. It has to have a certain level of humidity and certain hot temperatures and so on. So we're going to see again the creation of a commercial enterprise, an agricultural enterprise, that will be known as the plantation. In this case, we're talking about the sugar plantation itself. Again, this is an agricultural enterprise in which the people that are actually running the plantation, what they're actually trying to do is grow sugar on a massive scale for exports. That's what a plantation is. It's not a farm. A farm, again, is different from a plantation in that in a farm, people grow foodstuffs that are consumed locally or regionally by the people that surround the farm, whether it's the family or the town, etc. Foodstuffs, people actually eat something like grains and vegetables and so on. But in a plantation, people are growing exotic plants, okay, that are extremely pricey, valuable, again, in certain regions of the world that are not necessarily connected to the region from which the plantation actually is located. So again, it's for exports. So you're trying to actually, again, grow something exotic like sugar. It's exotic because this is something that you don't really need to, eat to live. Okay, so it's not like food, that food is required to sustain, of course, your life, but sugar is a luxury item. It's exotic, that is to say. So again, what we see is that we're going to see the emergence of plantations in which people are trying to grow certain exotic plants like sugar, for example, for export, for markets outside in different regions, of course, of the world, because there's a growing market for that, that is to say. And this is going to lead to, of course, the slave trade itself, particularly the arrival of different groups into the continent of Africa in pursuit of labor, because most of the sugar plantations that were located in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean Sea, in the eastern segments of the Mediterranean Sea, that actually had the ideal environment for the growth of sugar, they're hot and humid, were also ridden with mosquitoes, which there were carriers of a specific virus that was very lethal, by the way, known as malaria. Okay, malaria in the ancient world, malaria was lethal for a lot of people that had no exposure, no previous exposure, no immunity to malaria. They will be, of course, dying instantaneously in a couple of days again. After being infected again by the bite of the mosquito, because again, this is an area that is ridden with mosquitoes, the plantations itself. So what actually this led to is for the need, of course, to seek for labor, because many of the people in the Middle East or in the Eastern Mediterranean, again, this is the Mediterranean Sea, by the way, this is the Middle East. You can see the areas of green that were growing sugar, again, trying to produce sugar for the market, for exports. they were dying in great numbers because they had no resistance to malaria, and because of the heat strokes sometimes that they suffer by working in the fields, in high temperatures, in very humid environments. It was, very suffocating in many cases. So that, of course, led the Arabs, in this case, the Arab traders, the merchants, many of whom were connected to those sugar plantations, to seek an alternative source of labor. And that alternative source of labor, of course, was found in the continent of Africa itself, because the peoples of Africa, it was well known back during that time, that had, in a certain sense, grown or had developed a certain degree of immunity to malaria. They were not 100% immune, but malaria was rampant in Africa for thousands of years ago, that the peoples of Africa had developed a certain degree of resistance to that. So that led, again, the Arab traders to initiate this slave trade by moving into the north section of the continent and also to the eastern section of Africa, East Africa, to North and East Africa, and they're beginning to move there in great numbers in order to actually trade products that they bring from the Middle East, moving to those kingdoms of the north and east sections of the continent of Africa, and trade those products for labor, for servants. So again, the development of the slave trails, if you will, in which the trade was taking place between the Middle East and Africa. And this is how we're going to see, again, people moving out of Africa, precisely because they're now being moved into those sugar plantations to grow sugar. So sugar is fundamental to understand the emergence of this export slave trade out of Africa, because it was the necessity, the need for labor, in which people are going to be now growing sugar in those plantations, and for markets, of course, the need to accelerate the production of sugar. That led the planters, the plantation owners in the Middle East, for the most part, to actually require, again, the type of labor that will withstand, if you will, the kind of conditions of plantation work in hot and humid environments, and also with the exposure of malaria as well. Okay, so again, this is extremely important, again, to note. It's extremely important to realize, again, that the export slave trade started back as early as the 8th, 9th century, AD of the contemporary era. And again, this is a process that, as I mentioned a moment ago, of course, started out with sugar production and the need for plantation labor. And again, now people from outside of Africa are arriving in great numbers in the 8th and 9th century, moving forward, precisely for, again, in pursuit of that labor to grow sugar. So this is important to note, because 8 or perhaps even 9 out of 10 people that will be exported during this time, during this early process of the of the export slave trade out of Africa, 8 or 9 out of 10 people ended up in a sugar plantation, by the way. Not all, but the vast majority ended up in one sugar plantation or another, as they were being exported out, of course. Some of them, of course, ended up also doing agricultural work in other places in the Middle East, for example, construction work. There was mining taking place, etc. So yes, there were other activities as well. But the primary economic activity in which most African slaves were actually moved into was the sugar plantation itself. And again, so this is something that, again, is taking our story now to the 8th and 9th century. We're actually going to make a stop here, because when we come back in session 2, we're actually going to proceed by understanding the emergence of the slave trade and how the sugar plantation was fundamental, again, for the acceleration of this kind of export slave trade and precisely as we move into the 13 and 1400s, when, of course, sugar was beginning to be commercialized in Europe, in the Mediterranean Ocean, in the western portion of the Mediterranean Ocean, by the way, and the Spanish and the Portuguese are beginning to try to find land and islands where they can actually grow the sugar for the European market, and how the discovery of America in 1492 actually solved that problem again of the lack of land for the Portuguese and the Spaniards, the land that they were actually looking for precisely to grow sugar, and how the colonization of America again also served as a stepping stone for the acceleration of the slave trade, in which now the Americas, and to a very great degree, are going to be used to produce sugar by the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but also later on, as we move into the 1600s and 1700s, by the Dutch, French, and British as well. So again, this is something that we're going to cover in great depth in session 2. As for now, we have actually arrived to the end of today's session, and I'll see you then in session 2 to resume this discussion. Thank you.